The kennel gate was frozen shut, and the dog behind it hadn't stood up in 2 days. His hips had given out sometime in December, the shelter volunteer said, and now he mostly lay curled against the concrete, with his muzzle gone white, and his ribs showing through a coat that used to be thick enough to shrug off a Kandahar sandstorm. Nobody at Cold Creek Regional Animal Control knew his real name. The intake sheet just said K9, approx, age 11, surrendered, contractor closure. Then the front door opened, and a man in a faded navy fleece stepped into the cold, and the dog's head came up off the concrete for the first time in 2 days. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and follow it until the very end. What you're about to hear will restore your faith in the people around you. Petty Officer First Class Ray Dutton hadn't planned on being in Cold Creek, Montana that Tuesday. He'd driven 90 minutes out of his way after a Facebook post from a stranger, a blurry photo of a graying German Shepherd behind a chain-link fence, captioned, "Does anyone recognize this military dog? Vet says he won't make it much longer." Ray had almost scrolled past it. He'd almost scrolled past 100 posts like it over the years, the way you learn to armor yourself against grief you can't do anything about. But something in the eyes stopped his thumb. He'd know those eyes anywhere. He'd slept next to them in a plywood hooch outside Songin for 14 months. Ray was 39 years old, built lean and wiry in the way of men who'd spent most of their adult lives carrying 80 pounds of gear at a run. He stood just under 6 feet, with a close beard going iron gray faster than the hair on his head, and pale hazel eyes that had the particular stillness of a man who had spent years watching doorways and tree lines without ever quite being able to stop. People who met him for the first time sometimes mistook the stillness for distance, for a kind of coldness. It wasn't that. It was economy. He had learned, a long time ago, that a man who reacts to everything eventually has nothing left to react with when it actually matters. He was not unfriendly by nature. Combat had simply sanded down the parts of him that used to speak first and think second. He moved through a room the way he moved through everything now, quietly, thoroughly, cataloging exits before he'd even decided to sit down. It wasn't paranoia. It was a habit that had kept him alive through 2 deployments to Helmand Province with an East Coast-based SEAL team, running dog handler operations that the Navy still wouldn't fully declassify. He'd left service 4 years ago on a medical retirement after a compressed disc and a hearing injury from a breaching charge that had gone off 11 feet closer than the op plan called for. He didn't talk about that day. He talked, when he talked at all, about the dog. Diesel had been assigned to him during his 2nd deployment, already a veteran handler dog by then, already carrying 2 Purple Hearts worth of shrapnel scars that the Navy didn't officially award to working dogs, but that every handler on the team knew to respect. Diesel had found 4 IEDs that Ray knew about, and probably others that Ray never learned about. Because that was the nature of the job, you only heard about the ones that almost got you. When Ray's contract ended and his medical board came through, the process for adopting your own working dog was supposed to take 90 days. It took Ray 14 months of paperwork, phone calls, and finally, a congressional inquiry filed on his behalf by a chaplain who'd served with him before the Navy released Diesel's retirement papers. By then, through a clerical error Ray still didn't fully understand, Diesel had already been transferred to a private contractor kennel in Montana that handled surplus working animals for 3 different service branches. The contractor's paperwork said the dog had been euthanized 18 months prior due to age and cost of care. Ray had grieved him for 3 years believing that. He'd been wrong. And now he was standing in a gravel parking lot in 11-degree weather, looking through a chain-link fence at a dog who was trying, with everything his ruined hips had left, to stand up and come to him. Cold Creek Regional Animal Control sat on the edge of town behind a co-op grain elevator, a low cinder-block building with fluorescent lights that hummed audibly even from the parking lot, and a smell, once you stepped inside, of bleach fighting a losing battle against something underneath it. The floor was cracked linoleum, buffed to a dull shine by decades of mop water. Somewhere in the back a radiator clanked. Outside, snow had been falling since early morning, fine and dry, the kind that didn't melt on contact with anything, and it had drifted into knee-deep ridges along the fence line where the wind pushed it. The cold wasn't dangerous cold yet. It was the kind of cold that got into your knuckles and stayed there. The kind old men in this part of Montana called just weather, while their joints told a different story. The volunteer who'd posted the photo, a woman named Connie Pruitt, who ran the shelter's social media page in her spare time, met Ray at the door with her arms crossed against the chill and an expression that was trying hard not to be hopeful. She'd worked at Cold Creek for 6 years and had learned not to get her hopes up about anything involving Marlon Voss, the man who ran the county's animal control contract and, not coincidentally, sat 2 seats down from the county commissioner at the Rotary Club breakfast every Thursday. "He's real weak, Mr. Dutton," Connie said. "Vet's coming Thursday, but honestly, Thursday might be too late for some of what's wrong with him." "His name's Diesel," Ray said. "Not K9 approx, age 11. Diesel had gotten himself up onto 3 legs by the time Ray crossed the room, his back left leg trembling and refusing to bear weight. And when Ray went down on one knee in front of the kennel, the dog pressed his skull through the chain link with a force that suggested he'd have gone through the fence entirely if his body had let him. Ray put both hands against the graying muzzle and felt something come loose in his own chest that he hadn't let move in 3 years. "Hey, brother," Ray said. His voice didn't shake, but it dropped low, the way it used to when he gave commands in the dark. "Hey, I got you. I got you now." Diesel made a sound Ray had heard exactly twice before in 14 months of combat deployment. Not a bark, not a whine, but something closer to a moan, low in the chest. The sound the dog made when he'd found something and needed Ray to understand the size of it before Ray got close enough to see for himself. Connie watched the 2 of them and had to look away toward the window for a moment. What neither of them knew yet, what Connie herself hadn't been told, because Marlon Voss had made very sure of that, was that Diesel wasn't the only military working dog who'd passed through this facility marked for disposal in the last 18 months. And Diesel wasn't the sickest one. Marlon Voss had held the county's animal control contract for 11 years, and in that time, he had built a small, comfortable kingdom out of an unglamorous line item in the county budget. He was 56, silver-haired, and had the practiced warmth of a man who'd spent decades convincing county commissioners that he was doing them a favor by taking a thankless job off their hands. What almost nobody in Cold Creek knew was that Voss's kennel operation had a side arrangement with 2 private military contractors who handled working animal transition services for bases in 3 states. A euphemism for what happened to service dogs who aged out, washed out, or became too expensive to maintain. Voss got a flat per-animal intake fee from the contractors regardless of what happened to the dog afterward. Full veterinary care cost money he didn't have to spend if the paperwork simply listed an animal as deceased natural causes a few months after intake. Nobody audited it. Nobody had ever asked to. He'd been doing this since before Connie Pruitt started volunteering, and in that time exactly 4 families had ever come looking for a specific dog by name. All 4 had been told the dog was already gone. Voss didn't think of himself as a cruel man. He thought of himself as efficient. He'd said as much, once to a county clerk who'd questioned an invoice. "Nobody's coming for these dogs. They served their purpose. This is just paperwork now. He believed it completely. And that belief was exactly what had let this go on for as long as it had. He drove a newer truck than his salary should have allowed and sat on the Parks and Recreation Board in addition to his contract work. A position that gave him just enough visibility in Cold Creek to be liked and just enough obscurity to never be questioned. He golfed with the county attorney twice a summer. When a young reporter from the regional paper had once asked, mildly, about the shelter's euthanasia rate for older working dogs, Voss had smiled and talked for 11 minutes about compassionate end-of-life care until the reporter had nothing left to write down that sounded like a story. Nobody in Cold Creek had ever seen the inside of the back kennels where the closure contract animals were kept separate from the adoptable dogs out front. Nobody had ever asked to. Ray didn't confront Voss that first day. He'd learned patience the hard way, in rooms far more dangerous than a county animal shelter, and patience told him that the first move mattered more than the fastest one. He asked Connie for the intake paperwork on Diesel. He asked when the closure contractor had brought him in, and under what documentation, and whether there were other animals from the same transfer batch. Connie didn't have authority to pull those records without Voss's approval, and when she asked him for it that afternoon, Voss told her the closure files were sealed for privacy, and that Ray Dutton should feel free to adopt the dog and be on his way, since clearly he cared so much. "He's not going anywhere today, Mr. Dutton," Voss told Ray directly, when Ray came back to the front desk. "That dog's a liability. Hip dysplasia, cardiac murmur the vet flagged 8 months back, and frankly, at his age, I'd think a man who served would understand when it's time to let an animal go with dignity instead of dragging this out." Ray looked at him for a long moment. "You flagged a cardiac murmur 8 months ago," he said, "and you didn't treat it. We treat what the budget allows. He's a decorated federal working animal. There's a transition protocol. I've read it. You haven't followed a single line of it." Voss smiled the smile of a man who has never once been made to answer for anything. "You want to file a complaint? The county office is 2 miles down Route 12. I'll have paperwork ready for you whenever you'd like to actually adopt him instead of standing in my lobby lecturing me." Ray drove to the county office that same afternoon. He filed the complaint. He also, quietly, made 2 phone calls from his truck in the parking lot, one to a former teammate who now worked for the Naval Criminal Investigative Service's Animal Welfare Liaison Office, a position that existed specifically because incidents like this kept happening, and nobody in Washington wanted to admit how often. The second call was to a Great Falls veterinarian named Dr. Sarah Okafor, a former Army vet tech who'd left service to open her own large animal practice, and who, Ray knew from a mutual contact, had spent the last 2 years quietly building a reputation for taking in retired working dogs other people had given up on. Dr. Okafor drove out the next morning, unannounced, with a mobile diagnostic unit in the back of her truck. She examined Diesel in the parking lot because Voss wouldn't authorize use of the shelter's exam room for an unaffiliated veterinarian. What she found confirmed what Ray already feared. Diesel's heart murmur had progressed untreated. His hips had deteriorated past the point where medication alone would manage the pain. And his blood work showed the kind of chronic, low-grade malnutrition that comes not from starvation but from months of the cheapest feed a contract allows, stretched as far as a budget line would let it stretch. "He's got fight left in him," Dr. Okafor told Ray, crouched beside the dog in the snow, her breath fogging in the cold. "But not much time. If we're going to do something, it's now, not Thursday." That night, Diesel's condition worsened. Connie called Ray at 9:40 p.m., past shelter hours, using her own key, because she'd stayed to check on him, and found him lying flat on his side, breathing shallow, unable to lift his head. Ray broke every speed limit on Route 12 getting there. When he came through the kennel door, Diesel's tail moved once against the concrete, just once, and then went still. Ray got down on the floor beside him. He didn't call out. He didn't panic. He put one hand flat against Diesel's ribs and felt the fast, thin heartbeat under his palm, and he talked to him low and steady, the same voice he'd used in a dozen compounds, when the only thing standing between chaos and control was his own composure holding. "Not like this," Ray said quietly. "Not after everything. You don't get to go out on a concrete floor in Montana. Not you." Dr. Okafor arrived within the hour with oxygen and a portable ultrasound. What she found sent both of them to the emergency clinic in Great Falls at 11 that night. 90 minutes each way in a snowstorm that had thickened into the kind of whiteout that swallows headlights whole. Diesel's heart was in acute failure. The murmur Voss had flagged and ignored for 8 months had progressed into something that, treated even a month earlier, would have been manageable with medication. Treated now in an emergency room at midnight, it was a coin flip. Ray sat on the clinic floor for 6 hours. He did not sleep. He did not check his phone. He kept one hand resting against the kennel bars where Diesel lay sedated and stabilizing, and somewhere around 4 a.m. Dr. Okafor came out and told him the heart had responded to the medication and stabilized. At least for now. At least enough to buy time neither of them had expected to get. By the time the sun came up over Great Falls, Ray's phone had 14 missed calls. Connie had gone to the county board that morning, shaking, and told them everything. The sealed files, the flat intake fees, the 4 families who'd been turned away over the years believing their dogs were already dead. She hadn't planned to. She'd simply reached the point where staying quiet cost more than she had left to give. Ray's insist contact called at 7 a.m. A federal review of the contractor's transition services agreement was already being opened, prompted by Ray's initial complaint the day before, and Connie's statement had now given investigators exactly the internal witness they needed. By that afternoon, county officials had suspended Voss's contract pending investigation and formally requested the sealed closure files, the ones that would show, over 18 months, how many other retired service animals had passed through Cold Creek, marked deceased while very much alive, and how many had not survived long enough for anyone to ask questions. Marlon Voss met the county administrator and 2 sheriff's deputies at the shelter that same afternoon, in front of the same front desk where he'd told Ray that the dog was a liability. He tried the same tone he'd used for 11 years. Reasonable, weary, a man doing an unglamorous job nobody appreciated. "This is a misunderstanding," Voss said. "I've run this shelter for 11 years without a single complaint from this county. You've run it for 11 years without anyone looking," the administrator said. Voss's composure held for exactly as long as it took the deputies to ask him to produce the sealed closure files himself, in front of them. Right now. It didn't survive that. He said the files were at his home office. He said he'd need his attorney present before releasing any further records. He said at one point that these were federal contractor documents and the county had no standing to demand them. A claim that lasted until the NSYS liaison on speakerphone informed him that federal jurisdiction was exactly why he no longer had a choice in the matter. It didn't work on federal auditors the way it had worked on county clerks for a decade. Ray stood by the door with Diesel resting against his leg and said nothing. He had already said what needed saying 2 days earlier in this same lobby. There was nothing left to add, and adding something now would only have made the moment about him instead of about the 19 animals whose names were about to be read out loud for the first time in years. Voss was placed on administrative leave within the hour. The county's contract with his company was terminated by end of business that same day. The federal review that followed over the coming months uncovered records for 19 animals whose paperwork didn't match their fates, dogs marked deceased, who had, in fact, lived out their final months exactly the way Diesel nearly had, and at least 6 who had not survived long enough for anyone to come looking. Voss was never able to explain, to the satisfaction of investigators, where the itemized veterinary budget for those 19 animals had actually gone. He was charged the following spring with felony theft of federal funds and animal welfare violations, and the case remains, as of this telling, still working its way through federal court. Diesel came home to Ray's house outside Cold Creek 11 days later on a Thursday, in a truck with the heat cranked all the way up. 3 months after that, on a morning in late April, when the snow had finally surrendered to mud and the first green was pushing up along the fence line, Ray sat on the porch steps of his house with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, watching Diesel move slowly across the yard on hips that would never fully heal, but that carried him, these days, at something close to a normal old dog's pace. Diesel stopped at the fence line, lifted his graying muzzle into the wind, and held it there for a long moment the way he used to hold a scent in Helmand, out of habit now more than necessity, and then turned and walked back toward the porch and lay down in a patch of thin spring sun at Ray's feet, with a sound that was almost unmistakably contentment. Connie Pruitt still works at Cold Creek Animal Control, though the county has since restructured the entire contract system and instituted federal working animal oversight that didn't exist before. She keeps a photo on her desk of Diesel's first morning at Ray's house. Ears up, eyes clear. Dr. Sarah Okafor's practice now maintains a standing arrangement with 3 county shelters to review any working animal intake within 48 hours, unpaid, because she says some debts don't have an invoice attached to them. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with sirens or thunder or any of the drama we've come to expect from the word. Sometimes they arrive as a blurry photograph on a stranger's Facebook page, seen at exactly the right moment by exactly the right person, who still remembers a set of eyes from a plywood hooch on the other side of the world. Loyalty isn't a contract that expires when the paperwork says it does. It's a covenant, and the ones who carry it on 4 legs have earned every bit of the honor we're capable of giving them. God does not always send rescue with warning or ceremony. Sometimes he simply lets a tired man scroll 1 post further than he meant to on one ordinary Tuesday and calls that enough. If Diesel's story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that loyalty like this still exists in the world. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and if you've ever been reunited with someone or something you thought you'd lost for good. We'd love to hear that story too. If you believe in the courage of the people who serve and the animals who serve beside them, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next journey. May God bless you, protect your family, and remind you always, you are never alone, and neither is anyone still waiting for someone to come back for them.